This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
And this is Tyler Johnson with CloudBees.
Today, we're going to talk about automation and federal code. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest today in the virtual studio is Tyler Johnson, Federal CTO at CloudBees. You can find it just like it sounds, cloudbees.com. And today we're going to talk about automation and software development and DevSecOps and a lot of different kind of complicated questions. But the real question my listeners have is, what can CloudBees do for federal listeners? So jump right in there, Tyler.
Thanks, John. So just a little bit of background on CloudBees and kind of who we are. We're about 15 years old now at this point, and we are a DevSecOps software solution. A lot of you might be familiar with an open source project called Jenkins. We are the corporate sponsor to that project. It's very popular. And beyond that, we've kind of expanded into the world of more advanced DevSecOps strategies, mostly in support of things like financial tech, big banking, and of course, our most important customers being our federal clientele, our government users, kind of helping them automate the software delivery lifecycle.
I think you and I last week were at the Amazon Web Services Public Summit, 10,000 people. It was just crushed. So many people lined up for all kinds of courses. So let's say I'm a federal technology professional. I'm walking around the show and I see the booth, CloudBees. I see a guy with a beard there. Guy looks just like you. And so I walk up to you and go, how can you help me increase security or reduce time to delivery for my agency? So what's your sitting at a show booth answer?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks everyone for attending AWS Public Sector Summit. If you were there, it was a great time. It was a zoo, but it was a fun time. And we got to do a little bit of a talk on mission ready pipelines at the same time. But if you're walking by CloudBees and you see the name and you're wondering, what could this possibly mean? And how can this help me? We are really focused on connecting all of the other point providers and solutions that you may see on that show floor into one continuous build, test, and deployment pipeline for your software artifacts. So we're really focused on security, standardization, and building the most quality pipelines for your products to support the mission that you're tasked in accomplishing.
So you mean shift left, is that correct then, Mr. Johnson?
That's right. Shift left. You can't listen to a DevOps talk or a podcast like this without shift left coming into the equation, right? What does it mean to shift left? How do we get more security as a focal point in the development lifecycle? We're a huge part of that, integrating that into Jenkins pipelines. And then even more so, and John, I'm interested to kind of hear what you think about this as well, which is shifting left to me is moving the inflection point of when do we make a corrective action or when do we propel an artifact further towards production? And how do we move that inflection point towards the beginning of the development cycle rather than a review cycle before it goes in front of like a release board?
Yeah, that's a tough one there. Well, Tyler, this is a time of year where I go online and I order tickets for Wolf Trap, and I normally see the National Orchestra, maybe an opera. And so that's what I think is orchestration. Yeah. However, if I were to sit next to you at Wolf Trap and I'd say, that's orchestration, you say, hey, John, you're out of your mind. That's not orchestration. This is release orchestration. So that's the hashtag associated with your company. So not Wolf Trap here. So what the heck is release orchestration?
It's a great question. Yeah, and it's kind of a new and expanding area. And you'll see a lot of reports from the Forrester and Gartners of the world. Release orchestration, if you think about the general software delivery lifecycle, right? It's changed quite a bit with the change of technologies, moving away from waterfall to now microservices to Agile to DevOps. And if we think about release orchestration, it's kind of like a macro level, higher than CI/CD, right? Because you have all of these different point tools. You may have multiple different work streams, and especially in the federal workplace, you may have different providers working on different parts of an application, either in the form of contractors or government employees. Release orchestration is about getting that comprehensive view of the entire chain of custody that goes into a single release candidate, whether it be an application line or an individual service, right? how do I independently verify and validate that what's happened in my CI pipelines meets the standard of deployable by my government organization? And that's really the name of the game, right? Making it as data oriented and driven as possible to get a predictable release.
So this release is black or white, all or none. You release the whole entire code and then make corrections, or is it partial release, or how is this all, actually accomplished?
Great question. There's a million different ways to release software today. So some folks are still doing like big batch releases of an entire application where they're doing integration testing across every single service, and then they're rolling that out to their user community. Where it's really moving are smaller releases of an individual service focused on a single team. But that doesn't mean that the amount of testing and the amount of qualitative analysis that goes into a smaller release component is any different than that of a large waterfall-esque release, right? That same rigor needs to be built into the release strategy. So how do we expedite that process from being something like a change approval board that may take several weeks and a lot of full-time human bodies reviewing evidence across logs and scan results into one that's automated? So it's a lot simpler for someone to come in and make a decision.
Well, not everyone has a greenfield and releases new code and starts a new project. And typically, so let's say there's the Gilroy vulnerability that's found, and then we go to you, go, well, hey, Tyler, we have this vulnerability in our application program. Now what? Did you fit in there? Is this part of continuous delivery?
Great. Good question. And honestly, I know everyone's not greenfield. And for those of you listening, this is a particular strength for a provider like ourselves, CloudBees, right? We pride ourselves in being an integration engine. And that means both kind of moving towards the future, moving towards things like cloud native, Kubernetes native, containers, and all of that wonderfulness that comes with microservices. And then also reaching back and pulling some of the more legacy systems that may be still using the mainframe or maybe using legacy versions of source code management and tools like that, kind of bridging that divide so that we can all move in one agile process towards the future. And then, like you mentioned, right, it's not just about moving into a greenfield environment. It's about how do I also adopt agile processes for legacy systems that maybe will never be container-based, and maybe they don't need to be, right? But we can still drive new functionality at the same pace that we would for a brand new application.
So Tyler, you just said source code management. There is another phrase associated with the company. It's called stream management platform. Complete different things or parallel?
Related, right? And source code management would feed into this, right? Because you'd want to pull things like change logs, you'd want to see things like PR history, the comments associated with general tasks or stories or bug fixes that may stem from an issue tracker like Jira. But stream management honestly takes a different meaning for, I think, every single user that I get the chance to speak with, right? And it's really at its core baseline. It's about how do I measure the quality of my software artifacts that I'm pushing forward for the American taxpayer or the warfighter or whoever that consumer may be. And at the same time, how do I also get some measurements in how to improve my processes around the development, testing, and rollout of those features? So it's kind of a two-pronged approach. And I feel like sometimes we get lost in the sauce of value streams when really it's about measuring those two primarily, and how do we improve based off of those measurements?
Well, everyone knows about the executive orders. Everyone knows about zero trust. You could walk into the 7-Eleven and they talk zero trust. Probably at Wolf Trap, you walk in the concession stand, they're talking about zero trust there. They're talking zero trust anywhere. I want to talk about a different type of trust. And this is a trustworthy pipeline. And so part of this orchestration has got to be understanding. It's almost like the chain of evidence, the chain of trust. And so what you're ensuring is the chain of trust here, aren't you?
Absolutely, right. And that's kind of where release orchestration fits into this as well. You kind of heard me mention it as IV and V. Another way of thinking about this is how do we standardize the pipelines and the release paths going to production? And for those of you who are at AWS Public Sector Summit, you may have seen our little talk. We had a lightning talk about trustworthy pipelines for mission-ready software. It was brief, 15 minutes, but it's really all about building best of breed with the tools that are specific to you and your agency. And one thing for any listener here is just because it's working well for Treasury or just because it's working well for the Air Force doesn't mean those exact same tools work well for you. Everyone is individual. You're working on different tasks. make sure that tools that fit your mission can be incorporated in your pipelines. And when you build those pipelines, make sure that you can standardize them. You can enforce things like compliance checks throughout. And then once you build those standard pipelines, now we can start to embrace more advanced topics like continuous RMF, or as most people talk about, continuous ATO, where I validate my pipelines. And now everything that goes through these pipelines can then assume that same accreditation going into production.
I'm glad you brought up the public summit, because when I was at your website this morning, cloudbees.com, I found a white paper, and the title of the white paper is The Federal Government, Speeding Service Delivery with DevOps. Bang! Doesn't cost anything. Anyone listening to this podcast can go there, download it. All of a sudden, you got a basis of discussion. If you want to see CloudBees at the next trade show, you want to get a hold of Tyler, ask questions, or compare him, or find out what the heck Jenkins is all about. I mean, this is, I've seen a lot of white papers in my day. This is probably the most practical one I've seen, because it's based on a benefit to the federal government, and then basic questions. Bang, what is continuous delivery? Bang, what's the way forward? Jenkins, what's this? Continuous delivery. It's a very practical white paper. And what I'll do is I'll keep a link to this in the show notes so you can just download this. But yeah, it's a real nice white paper. We talked a little about trust, and there's, when I read some stuff on your website, I went to your Twitter feed, I saw your last tweets for the last 6 months, and this thing popped up. And I try to keep up with things. I do. I try to keep up with, SaaS, infrastructure as a service, ransomware as a service, all kinds of acronyms. But there's a new acronym, EAC, everything as code. Bang. I wouldn't get that on any kind of quiz show. So EAC, help me out of this morass. What is that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a high level way of saying, there's all of these different methodologies. Infrastructure as code, configuration as code, there's source code, there's all of these things measured as code. Why not just bundle it all as everything as code? And that includes, right, the applications that are running your CI/CD pipelines or your delivery pipelines. And that's really where we come from. If you're seeing it via our Twitter feed or online from CloudBees, we're talking about our services as code as well, right? Because for a lot of folks in our federal practice and consumers, they're not just a point and click. I commit code and it goes to production. It's not that easy. And a lot of listeners are probably thinking right now, boy, Tyler and John are making this sound really simple, but they don't understand that I have to deploy this to a sub, or I have to deploy this to a satellite. Well, when everything's configured as code, now think of the possibilities of transferring an entire pipeline, an entire body of evidence that proves out the worthiness of a release candidate or of a build artifact. I can move that from a low dev environment to a classified air-gapped environment. However you transfer that doesn't really matter, but the comprehensive details of the pipeline, of the audit trail, of all the evidence, that moves as well, because it is a versioned artifact that can be stored as code. And that's what makes DevOps, especially in the federal community, a more real solution, because without that, transferring that information is a really arduous and difficult task.
Whenever I hear DevOps, I think of my friend Jeff Gallimore and DevOps Days all day long talking about this. And he goes into very, very serious discussions about managing people, managing humans and code, and getting efficient results. And many times they talk about balance. They talk about governance and developer freedom and continuous delivery. And this is a tough little match to juggle. I mean, on the one hand, you want to have creative individuals that can, use their skills. On the other hand, we have compliance requirements. On the other hand, there's a deadline, Tyler, but you want your Tyler to be creative. So managing the humans in this continuous delivery model, I think that's an art.
I agree. And I think, this is a really, really good topic to bring up, just as a kind of DevOps or DevSecOps 101, right, is all about balancing, just like you mentioned, like what is developer freedom and how can we map as much of that, and autonomy, I should add in as well, for them to make their own decisions and build their own pipelines. How do we map as much of that into your business strategy, into your compliance regulations? And that's a really difficult balance. Like, I don't want to oversimplify it because it really isn't something that's very easy. So for a lot of folks, I think the best approach is not a one size fits all when you're starting to do DevOps practices. I talk to a lot of Jenkins users, and there's a wide array of knowledge. I've been using Jenkins for 15 years, for example, back when it was the Hudson project, back when it came from Bell Labs, right? Well, those folks, maybe you should allow them to write their own Jenkins pipelines. Maybe you should allow them to build artifacts the way that they've been doing it for the past 10 years and the way they know. But then there's a whole different audience that's, I'm a new user. I don't know what DevOps is. I don't know how pipelines work. Now we need to have a hybrid approach where this is a kind of as a service. We roll pipelines to them. They can click them with a one little button or one request with a PR, and they have a functional CI/CD pipeline. So that's kind of abstracted away from them. So I don't love the blanket approaches that a lot of people take, where it's like, this is the only way to do it. This is the way that we do DevOps. This is what it means to run a pipeline. Instead, be flexible. Allow the developers, listen to your actual users on what tools that they want to leverage, and keep them happy, because at the end of the day, they're the most important factor to any government organization when it comes to driving new features.
And that's why you have to let their creativity shine. And you can't, on the one hand, you have to say, here are the goals of the project, and then almost walk away and assume that they can figure out themselves, because this emotional mandate of, no, you're not going to have anyone working for you. You're going to have an empty house there.
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? I mean, you should have some baseline rules to start with. And I'll do my plug here that I do every single time I do a speech, or if I've done a white paper. I like to reference something called minimumcd.org. So for any of the listeners, if you have a chance, go take a look at it. And it's just a basic guideline of what it means to start a DevOps journey. And really the beginning of it is coming up with a couple of different rules, which are, what does it mean to be deployable? What does it mean to do continuous integration for your environment? How do I make immutable artifacts after they've been built so that we can trust the pipelines? And then again, those pipelines that are either pushing to an artifact registry or to an actual production environment, that is the definitive source of truth that meets the regulations required to go into a production environment. So if you start there, use that as a baseline, and then go consult folks like your developers and your security users and say, all right, help me understand the tools and the practices that map to these guidelines that can make you the most effective. That's where you're going to build something really, really special. And that's where you're going to be really, really performant when it comes to how quickly you can drive functionality to the user.
Sal, I've been married for 40 years. My wife tells me I'm insensitive, and I, came in with rough questions. But I'm going to ask you kind of a question that maybe ruffle some feathers here. And the question is why? I mean, why Jenkins? I mean, have you looked at others? Does it compete with something else? I mean, does this happen to be your favorite? I mean, you grew up driving Ford, so you drive a Ford now. I mean, so why Jenkins?
Yeah, great question, right? And being in my position and having worked on projects outside of the 9 to 5 as well, I've used almost every CI/CD engine that you can imagine that lives out in space. So I do have the experience there. Of course, most of my time is spent in Jenkins. And I will say this, right? Jenkins overall is an incredibly flexible engine when it comes to the integration points. There is a massive wealth of information out there from the open source community. So generally speaking, you're probably not the first person attempting to accomplish whatever automation task it is that you're working on. You probably can find some reference material. And, syntactically in Jenkins, for better or worse, some people will love or hate groovy syntax. It is a very powerful engine in order to accomplish complex logic. And we really are good at solving complex problems. There are other tools out there that maybe are directly in an IDE, things like a GitLab or a GitHub Actions come to mind. And I think those also have their place in the space. They're just less oriented to enterprise level DevOps and more oriented to, I have a small team of developers and this is going to work really well for me. So again, I don't want to tear down any of the other CI/CD providers. I think it's a very commoditized space and everyone has a piece of the pie that fits. But Jenkins' flexibility is truly unmatched, and the performance of the syntax and the complicated tasks that it can accomplish, quite honestly, other engines just aren't at that level. And that's just due to our massive open source heritage and duration or lifespan in the space.
So CloudBees is to Jenkins as Red Hat is to Linux?
Bang on. Perfect. Yes. That is a really good way of thinking about it. Exactly right. And we're responsible still for maintaining and managing roughly 80% of the open source code. And as a part of that, for some of our federal users, We also submit the open source project up to the Platform One team for hardening so that it can be pulled down from what they call Iron Bank, which is a registry sponsored by the Air Force with certified or rubber stamped images. So we certify both our product and the open source project. So we're still very closely tied to that community.
There's a popular pundit in town by the name of David Linthicum. I don't know if you know David or not, but very well known. He writes like, 1 million words a day. He's really a smart guy. I love David. And he had an article about cloud native. And apparently this is like, throw cheers. I hate you, Tyler. I hate you, John. You're an idiot. You're an idiot. Yelling and screaming. So this is a big debate in the community here, isn't it? What is cloud native? What isn't? I mean, this is, I don't even want to come near this one, but so where do you stand in this whole debate? Just run away from it?
No, I don't run away from it. My personal opinion is slightly detached from that of like the CloudBees message, right? So again, being a part of the CloudBees team and where we fit, we're all about supporting cloud native endeavors, right? Everything resides in cloud. Everything is built to run on cloud services. Everything is built to maximize what you get from a provider like an AWS or a Google Cloud or an Azure, right? That's a beautiful thought. And the context of kind of detaching yourself away from infrastructure management, that's really appealing to a lot of our users, because I think that's a big pain point. Where we fit in that story as you're moving towards a cloud native architecture, as you're moving towards container-based everything, for example, is sort of a bridge again, right? Because you're not going to do that overnight. You're not going to move everything to AWS for your production applications. Instead, you can run a hybrid sort of setup where you can migrate builds from an on-prem service that maybe is pulling code from something like an RTC, like a legacy source code management tool, and then migrate that to a pure cloud native environment. And my personal opinion, just around cloud native, while it is a very hot topic today, I would argue that not every application or not every business unit should be approaching cloud native architecture. It's good for some, but really the functional purpose of cloud native is no different than if you're running it on-prem. So it's really about, do you have the people, the budget, and the processes in place to manage your own infrastructure, to manage your own rollouts of production applications? Or if you don't, then cloud native maybe has a bigger role in your future of your organization.
We're kind of running out of time here. I always have this open-ended question at the end here. 5 years down the road, where do you see the whole idea of process automation, release orchestration evolving?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that in 5 years from now, especially in the federal community, right now, there's a lot of knowledge around continuous integration. And there's a lot of really good efforts that go into building artifacts, building database schema or infrastructure as code really quickly through tools like Jenkins or GitLab, you name it. In the next 5 years, I think we're going to see the big jump, which is kind of maintaining that same velocity that you're getting from the developer side inside of CI engines, all the way out to continuous delivery. Because right now, that hasn't occurred. Like that jump has not been made. It's still a pretty long and slow process to get something in production. And even more so, and you mentioned it earlier with the executive mandates, we've seen a huge push around continuous ATO. What does it mean to get a continuous ATO? How do I preserve this? Well, what we know for sure is that a continuous ATO falls short in continuous monitoring, right? What happens when a Log4 shell comes out again, or a SolarWinds hack comes out again? The next 5 years, I really hope to see, because I'm already seeing the building blocks and foundation coming into place, an effort to do more event-based scanning while working on real-time production applications and tying that back into the processes that go into CI/CD workflows. So how can I quickly recover from a non-performant or non-conformant security vulnerability that may come through in production? That's the big next step. And as a part of that, I think is also going to be value streams as well, right? Really people hammering down into what works well, what doesn't, and how do we make this more performant overall?
Yeah, and that just has automation all over both those aspects you brought up, because humans just as a limit to what you can actually accomplish in some of this complexity, way beyond 5-10 years ago. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Tyler Johnson, Federal CTO at CloudBees.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.